This is an amazing picture. It's just such a sweet picture of God's covenant love for his people, but also, by extension, God's covenant love for us. Because what does it say there? Love a woman who is, not was, is loved by her husband. Hosea dearly loved Gomer. He loved her dearly. She's his wife. He covenanted with her, and he has just such a sweet, tender love. And so this is a story of a man who's heartbroken, right? He's heartbroken because of what his wife has done and turned away from him. And this was not private, right? Everyone knew. This was public. Everyone knew what was going on. But what's the key here? What's the key phrase of it? The key phrase is here. It's ultimately not about Hosea and Gomer, even as the Lord loves the sons of Israel, okay? So the book of Hosea, ultimately, who is it about? It's about God. It's about God's covenant love for his people, the Israelites. But then beyond that, it's about God's covenant love for us. So she was loved by her husband, even when she's going through this adultery. She is loved by Hosea. But farmer, what's God saying in this? He's saying, I love you, Israelites. I love you, even though you are wandering into idolatry and spiritual adultery. So what does he do? Look at verse 2. I bought her for myself. I mean, she's his wife. She's his wife. And yet, apparently, kind of like a slave market thing, he had to go and he had to pay for her. Literally, this is real. This isn't just a story. This is real. He really did. He went to the slave, whatever it was, the market, and he bought her 15 shekels of silver and a homer of half of barley. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, it's actually very significant because according to Leviticus 27, the value in a vow, the value of redeeming back someone was 30 shekels of silver. But he doesn't, apparently he doesn't have the full cash price. And so he takes all the money he has, 15 shekels of silver, and he takes some grain, which is the equivalent, that amount of grain is equivalent to the other 15 shekels. He buys her for the equivalent of 30 shekels of silver. So it's a very, very stunning picture of redemption, right? Scripture in the New Testament will use the term redemption of you. You were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ. You were bought back. That's the idea of you were redeemed. That's what this picture is. It's probably one of the best pictures, the most beautiful pictures in all of the Bible of what happens at your salvation, is that God redeemed you. And it wasn't with silver and gold, but what was it with? Something far more precious. Peter says the precious blood of Christ. That's what it was. He redeemed you with his blood. And so this is a picture. And it says that in the text. I mean, it's an illustration of, what God is going to do for his people. Yeah, Jack.
Is there any significance or whatever for note
I'm not aware of any. The question is, was there any connection between, Judas pays, was it 30 or 20? I forget. It was 30 shekels. So there's no indication that that's a connection. It's just the same amount. It's what they agreed to pay him. But I'm not aware of any direct connection. And you know me, I'm kind of a stickler. Unless it says it, I don't say it is. Yeah, it's not clear. But he ends up throwing that money back, right? He throws that money back. And we're actually going to look at that a little bit today because in Matthew chapter 10, there's Christ will say, whoever confesses me before men, I'll confess my Father. Whoever denies me before men, I'll deny before my Father. And then you say, wait a minute, what's the problem? 12 of those guys that are listening, every one of them denies Christ. They all run away. Peter himself denies Christ. And yet, what does Judas do? Judas, it says in the text, he goes out and hangs and kills himself as a final act of rebellion. What does Peter do? He goes out and weeps bitterly, which shows his heart, right? It shows his heart. So in that sense, there's the connection is that God, it doesn't mean you never stumble. It's not perfect faith, but it's a faith that God really is working through. But Judas didn't have that, but Peter did. So redemption. He bought her back for himself. For the equivalent of 30 shekels of silver. So there was a rebuke. Continue on, Hosea 4:1.
John, you got a question back there.
Yeah. Ben. I'm sorry. Jeremiah 3, it talks about he gave her a writ of divorce. Well, once again, it's using the marriage covenant, that they had broken that. It's an illustration of that, but we know that it's not going to be a permanent thing, right? Because we know that God still has a plan for Israel. We'll look at that in Isaiah. God still has a plan for them, but he's going to, he's going to be separated from them for a while. He is right now, right? He's separate from the people of Israel, but we know that will be restored. That will be restored. So I'm not sure there's a direct connection between that. Hosea 4:1, God rebukes them. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, or the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. God rebukes them because they don't care about knowing God. Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you've rejected knowledge. I also reject you from being my priest. Since you've forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. They didn't know God. At our men's retreat last weekend, we went over Philippians 3, spent a lot of time in that. And what does it say? The center of the Christian life is knowing God. Paul says, I consider all things as lost for the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. And Hosea says, you don't know me. You don't know me. I mean, you should know me. About God is saying this through Hosea. You should know me. I'm your God. I redeemed you. Now, this is post... so what's the picture? Also, part of the picture is the redemption of them out of Egypt. That is a connection. Yeah, so that's probably the better connection. It's back to Egypt. God has redeemed them out of Egypt, and yet they're not living in light of that. There's a great indictment of the leaders, Hosea 5:1. The leaders of the people of Israel. Hear this, O priests, give heed, O house of Israel, O house of the king, for the judgment applies to you, for you have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread out on Tabor. God rebukes, in the book of Hosea, God rebukes the leadership, like people like priests, that ultimately the leaders were not following God. He rebukes them in the north and the south, just for geographically. Tabor is in the northern kingdom. It's up north. Mizpah is down by Jerusalem. It's down in the southern kingdom. So basically, even though this is written primarily to the northern kingdom, it's talking about the whole thing. Is none of them were following God. So God says, I'm going to judge you. Hosea 6:6, for I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Remember we talked about last week? They were still doing the sacrifices, right? They're going through the religious rituals, kind of like the people of Christ's time. Remember, the Pharisees, they did all the. It says in the first century, they estimated 250,000 lambs would have been killed on a typical Passover in the first century. So they were doing all of that. But here he's saying, I don't delight in your sacrifices. I don't delight in your sacrifices at all. Does this verse ring any parallels to you? Biblical stories? Samuel and Saul. Remember 1 Samuel 15 when God had commanded Saul about the Amalekites, kill everybody, kill all the cattle, don't take anything. What happened? What did Saul do? Yeah. Samuel says, what's that I hear? What is the lowing of the cattle? Saul kept the cattle. And he says, why? Because I wanted to sacrifice them. And Samuel says that great 1 Samuel 15:22. He says, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in what? Obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. And this is very much of a parallel. It's a key theme. As you shared the gospel, many times when I share the gospel, you ask them, what is God? What is your relationship with God, and where are you at with God? Most people have the scale thing, right? I do enough good things. I sacrifice enough things. I'm good enough, and it's going to offset all these bad things I've done, right? And that's not the way God works. God says what? To obey is better than sacrifice. And plus, all those good things you think that are on the good side of the scale, guess what? Everything, Isaiah 64:6, your righteous deeds are as filthy rags. Everything is on the bad side of the scale. So, this is a very similar theme in Hosea. He's saying, what? I delight in loyalty. I delight in obedience rather than sacrifice. Hosea 8:1, put a trumpet to your lips. What? Announcing judgment's coming. Like an eagle, the enemy comes against the house of the Lord because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Remember the theme of Hosea is what? Loyal love, covenant-keeping love. God was keeping his part of the covenant. They were not. And because of that, they're going to be judged. It's going to be very, very serious because they've transgressed God's covenant. I'm just kind of working, I'm just hitting some highlights. I think I'm on page 263 there, Hosea 8, 5-6. He has rejected your calf, O Samaria, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence? Far from Israel is even this. A craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. Remember we talked about the book of Hosea is primarily against the northern kingdom. Okay? Samaria was the capital. Well, they had several capitals, but this was the main capital of the northern kingdom. And so when he says this about Samaria, and they says they have a calf, why are they having calves sacrificed at Samaria? Why are they doing that? Where are they supposed to be sacrificed? Jerusalem, right? When the northern kingdom separates from the southern kingdom in 930, Jeroboam knows, I don't want my people going down to Jerusalem, so he made other places, they called them high places where they could worship, Samaria, Dan, and so they would sacrifice to who? Who would they sacrifice those calves to? God, exactly. They were sacrificing them to God. And yet God says, no, it's an abomination to me. And this is going back to this and says, my anger burns against you because you're not truly worshiping me from the heart. And then the call of, turn the page on page 264, chapter 14, 265, chapter 14, verse 1. He says what? What's the key? Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. This is really the message of every single prophet. It's what? Return. Return. Often, one of the things I often have said is there's no time like today to repent, right? No time like today. Yeah, there's been bad things you've done, bad thing, but there's no time like today to repent. It's not like, well, we can continue down this path. No, repent, return to God. That's what his call to them is. And what does he say? This is a wonderful promise. I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them. What is that? Well, he's saying that there's going to come a time when I'm going to restore them. I'm going to restore them. I'm going to heal them from their apostasy. Now, as far as we understand, that's still future, right? God has not ultimately restored. I mean, look at the nation of Israel. There's more atheists in Israel than any other nation in the world. And so he's not done that yet, but he will. There will come a time when he will do that. And then it's not just for them. I love verse 9. Chapter 14. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them. What does that tell you? This is universal, right? This just isn't written, say, well, we're no longer the northern kingdom, southern kingdom, they went into exile, they're done. There's no value of this book for us. No, this is saying this book has value for you. It's kind of like an Old Testament version of 2 Timothy 3:16, 15 and 16. All Scripture is profitable. It's profitable for us. And so it's like, take heed. Take heed to your covenant God. Take heed to the loyal love your God has for you and follow him and repent and return. Okay? Well, what implications of the book of Hosea for our lives? Go ahead and turn to the person right next to you, and I want you to talk about it. This book was written a long time ago, almost 3,000 years ago. But talk about, or 2,500 years ago, what are the implications of the book of Hosea for our life? Okay? Go. Okay, let's talk about it. What are some implications of the book of Hosea? Even though it's written a long time ago, what are some implications of this book of Hosea for our lives? Yeah, way up there. Ben. Is that Ben? Yeah, Ben. Absolutely, I love it. That marriage is holy. That's a secondary application, but I think this is a wonderful picture of how important marriage is. And our society has tried to redefine marriage and basically just kind of trash it. But really, it doesn't matter what our society says marriage is. Why? Because God ordained marriage. God designed marriage. And I love the word you use, Ben, is holy. And the holy means to be set apart. That marriage is holy. It's not to be treated lightly. Even though in our society it just kind of gets whatever. No, it's something to be holy. And that's why we need to pray for the marriages of our church, right? Because Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5 that the marriage is a picture of Christ's relationships with his body, the church. So I often will say about marriage, there's more to marriage than meets the eye. It's not just what you see, right? There's more. It's a picture. It's a wonderful picture. Now, it also tells you, in light of what Ben said, it's holy, it also tells you how serious God was, that if he had his prophet go through something like this, because there was such an important point that he wanted to show. It's like, wow, it was a major issue on what he asked him to do. But yeah, I think that's a very, very good observation. Marriage is holy. Never treat marriage as lightly. It's when someone's, well, it just didn't work out. No, it's not about you. I'm just not happy in my marriage. Well, it's not about you. It's about God's glory. God's glory is at stake in all of our marriages, and that we would trust God for that and pray for that. It's one thing to, speak loudly against our society and vote and all that. It's fine. It's great. What's the most important thing we do? Have marriages that display Christ. That's the greatest testimony that we will make as Christians when they see our marriages, that they are truly glorify God and they're truly treated as holy. That's a great observation. Good. What else? Yeah, Ari. Okay, absolutely. Staying true to God's covenant. Absolutely. That's the theme of the book. Excellent. That it's a covenant. And they were not staying true to God's covenant. And you see it illustrated in a very sad and tragic way, because that shows how serious, and it's infinitely more serious when we are not faithful to the covenant that we have with God. Absolutely. That is really the center of the book is we have a covenant with God, right? We have a covenant with God. Now, it's an eternal covenant. You can't change it. And yet we need to be faithful to the covenant we have with Him. You don't just add Jesus to the shopping cart you're pushing through life. No, it's a covenant with Him. Great observation. What else? Implications from the book of Hosea. Yeah, Robin. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah, great. It shows how serious our unfaithfulness to God is. And you use the word despicable. And that's what it is. It's how serious. We look at Gomer and Hosea like, oh, well, that's an argument from the lesser to the greater. Our unfaithfulness is even a greater offense. Why? Hosea wasn't perfect. He was not perfect. He was still sinful, even though he was a faithful husband. We know that. But he was not perfect. God is perfect. God is holy. And so there is no excuse. So absolutely, it's a vivid picture of our unfaithfulness to God, how serious that is and how despicable that is, that it should motivate us. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to motivate Israel to turn back to their God in faithfulness. Yeah. Bill, did you have something? Okay. Yeah, the first marriage was in the garden when God formed Eve out of Adam's rib, and he brought her to him. The first giving away was in the garden. So it's a picture. I mean, it's a picture of God. And then there's the picture here the picture is of marriages of God as the husband, and we are to be faithful to him. Absolutely. Number of implications you've hit. God is full of grace and mercy. One of the things you have to see in this book is grace and mercy, right? It's gracious. I mean, Hosea, God calls him to go back, even though he didn't technically have to. God calls him to go back to show what? God says, I'm gracious, I'm merciful, I want to pour my love and loving kindness onto these wayward people. It's just filled with God's grace. This book is filled with God's mercy. And that picture follows suit to us, right? God's grace and God's mercy to us, that we were that wayward, adulterous wife. That's who we were, right? And it's a call for us to respond to his grace and mercy. And then God still has a plan for Israel. I mean, you can't look at the book and say, well, they were too disobedient. God's done with them. Well, the whole point is no. Even though they are very, 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 very disobedient, God's going to still restore them. That's the point, right? That's the whole point. If God doesn't still have a plan for Israel, then in the end, Hosea gets rid of Gomer. I mean, and he's done with her. She's too bad in the end, but he doesn't. He restores. So as far our understanding is that God still has a plan for Israel. Okay, wonderful book. If you didn't happen to read a book of Hosea last week, you haven't read it yet, encourage you. Read the book of Hosea. It's a sweet, sweet book. Okay? Well, let's turn over to Micah. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Micah. Turn to Micah in your Bible. Wonderful, wonderful little book. Really as a key aspect of justice. A lot of times people use the scales for the book of Micah to illustrate that. What comes to your mind when you think of the book of Micah? Anyone? What comes to your mind when you think of the book of Micah? What comes to your mind when you think of the book of Micah? Okay, where? Yeah, Bethlehem, okay? The great messianic prophecy of Bethlehem, that he would come from Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little. I mean, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Don, were you going to say that? Yes. I mean, there's some great messianic prophecies in this book. But other than that, probably not a lot that comes to your mind when you think of Micah. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more than that. Okay, who is the author? I'm on the page 267. We just don't know we don't know a lot about Micah. It's a great name. Great name. His name literally means who is like Yahweh. It's a shortened form of Micaiah. Actually, Micah, Bray, you got it, Micah. Yeah. We got two minor prophets, Jonah and Micah, okay? But Micah's a great name. And the name is incorporated in Micah 7:18, where it says, who is a God like you? That's the name, that's what the meaning of his name is. Who is a God like you who pardons iniquity? In other words, there is no God like you that actually pardons iniquity because of his grace. And so we don't know a lot about Micah. There is a reference, earlier Ben brought up Jeremiah, but there's a reference to Micah in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 26:18 says, Micah of Moresheth, that's where the Micah we're talking about, because that's where he is from, prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So now we know the context when he's prophesying. And he spoke to all the people of Judah. There's a lot in this passage. It tells you also who he's talking to, southern kingdom. Thus the Lord of hosts has said, Zion will be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem will become ruins, and the mountains of the house as the high places of a forest. So we get a lot of background from that. We get where he's from. He was during the time of Hezekiah. He's talking to the people of Judah. And so Micah's prophesying in the 8th century BC. Okay? So we're 2025, so he's 8th century BC, so about 2,700 years ago, approximately when he's prophesying. He was from Moresheth, okay? That's his hometown. Moresheth, if you read the other biblical accounts, was actually captured by Sennacherib. Sennacherib is the king of Assyria. When Assyria comes through in 701, Moresheth was one of the towns of the southern kingdom that was conquered. So what does this tell you? It's very likely that Micah saw his relatives and friends either killed or hauled off into slavery by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. So we think of these biblical writers as just some guy kind of in an office somewhere, writing this book. Well, he's not. I mean, this is his hometown. This is as if Spokane was destroyed and taken over by an enemy, and many people are killed, and many people are taken captive and taken far away. Micah would have experienced that, because we'll see that the Assyrian captivity happened, or exile happened during Micah's ministry. So it was a very, very real thing. He was from Moresheth Gath, okay, and so this is a town about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. So if we were to place Jerusalem, it would be kind of right about in here. Okay, there's Jerusalem in there, and so he's about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. This would be kind of in the area of the Philistines. Gath, Moresheth Gath, it's called. Gath, who was from Gath? Goliath, okay? So that's where he was from, which tells you what part of the kingdom was he from. From the southern kingdom, okay? From the southern kingdom, and he's going to direct his ministry here's another map of it, to the southern kingdom. Here's Jerusalem's right here. There's Jerusalem, and then Moresheth Gath is right here. It's in the Shephelah. Okay, I know this is from our geography class. Remember the 5 different areas. There's the Sharon Plain, the Shephelah, and then there's the hill country. He was from the Shephelah. That's kind of where the Philistines were from. This is just kind of a picture of his, just what is up there? Yeah. Judah. And now you can see, remember, before this, the northern kingdom went way up here, remember? Because the Assyrians were weak during the previous prophets, during the previous kings, but now it's shrinking down because the Assyrians have become more powerful. They've taken back over Damascus, so there's a lot of encroachment. It's a time of great difficulty. But Micah's ministry is primarily to Judah, even though it would apply to the northern kingdom as well, although partway through his ministry, the northern kingdom gets exiled. Okay? What's his message? Micah is a prophet of the downtrodden, exploited people of Judean society. By that I mean the southern kingdom. We think that injustice is just a modern thing. No, there was great injustice happening, and we'll see there's one of the classic verses in the whole of the Bible about God's concern for justice is in the book of Micah. So he's a prophet of those that were downtrodden. He prophesies during a time of great injustice. He has 3 messages or sermons. Each of them begin with the word hear or listen. Listen to this. It kind of introduces that. And God's standard of measurement was the Mosaic covenant. What's the Mosaic covenant? What's the Mosaic covenant? It's when the people of Israel came out of Egypt in 1446, and then they went to Mount Sinai, and God gives them, in a sense, we have what's called, the United States Constitution. He gives them their Constitution, and that's the Mosaic covenant. It's a covenant that God had made with His people. They become a nation. They're not a nation prior to that. Okay, they're just a big people group. But now they're a nation in 1446 when they come out of Egypt. And so all of the minor prophets, all the prophets, they are speaking. They're referring back to the Constitution, referring back to the Mosaic covenant that the people had violated. The theme of judgment is prominent, but the prophet also stressed restoration. This is from the Mosaic covenant, okay? This is the second part, round 2, 1446. They come out of Egypt. They go to Kadesh Barnea, and they send in the spies, 12 spies. 10 say no, 2 say go, and they reject. The people go with the majority, and they say, we'll be crushed in the land. And so God says, okay, you won't be crushed in the land. You're going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. So the whole generation, 2 million people, anyone that was old enough to be a soldier, 21 or older, they were killed over 40 years. And then 40 years later, 38 years later, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses reiterates the Mosaic covenant. It's second law, the second covenant. And so Deuteronomy 28 is a key passage for understanding the prophets. Why? Because this is what the prophets are referring back to. Deuteronomy 28, 1-2 says, "Now it shall be, if you will diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all His commandments which I command you today, the Lord, Yahweh, your God, will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings, all the blessings as you listen to the book will come upon you and overtake you." What? If you obey the Lord your God. I mean, what a wonderful promise. If you just follow God, just obey Him. You don't have to be perfect. He's provided the sacrificial system for your imperfections, but as a general pattern, tenor of your life, if you will follow God, then it'll be amazing, and you'll be a light to the nations. But the second part of that covenant, what is it? Later on in Deuteronomy 28, it says, "But it shall come about, if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe to do all His commandments and His statutes with which I am charging you today, then all these curses will come upon you and will overtake you." And so God is very clear. And so the prophets, when you read the prophets, any of the prophets, they're referring back even to Deuteronomy 28, to this particular passage, because they're just saying, well, God is faithful to His word, and He's just going to do what He said He's going to do. If you disobey, then these curses will come upon you. They're calling them back to the beginning that they would truly obey God. And so, Deuteronomy 28, really key to understand the prophets. Who's the audience? Micah's main audience was the people of the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay, that's who he's writing to. Part of it is because partway through his ministry, the northern kingdom is gone. In 722, the northern kingdom is taken away. They don't even exist in part of his ministry. And what's the point of this? Judah is just as guilty as Israel. Now, I'm using Israel there to refer to the northern kingdom. Who is the book of Hosea written against? Primarily the northern kingdom, okay? But now here comes Micah, and he's saying, you know what, southern kingdom, yeah, you had about 8 good kings out of 20, and yet you're just a little ways behind. But you're still on the same path of unfaithfulness. You're on the same path of idolatry and spiritual adultery. When Micah wrote this book, Israel was probably destroyed. Okay, by the time he writes the book, northern kingdom is probably destroyed. They probably don't even exist. They've been taken captive by the Assyrian Empire. So when he preaches his message, it's probably to Israel was probably alive, but when he writes the book, northern kingdom was probably taken captive. Date of the book, about 735 to 700 BC. Remember, the numbers go backwards, and that's why that's the key number for is 722. That's when the northern kingdom is taken into captivity, and so it's right in the middle of his ministry. Micah 7:1, the word of the Lord which came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, those are familiar, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Okay, here's our chart. This is on page 2 or 3 of your notes, just to kind of give you a background of where we are. Let's just kind of review the big picture headings that we have. Remember, the white books are the kind of the historical books. The first kind of the big historical thing that happens in captivity in Egypt in 1847 BC. That's the end of Genesis, between Genesis and Exodus, 1847. So you end book of Genesis in 1847 BC, and Jacob and all his descendants, 70 of them, go into Egypt. 400 years later, they're in Egypt for 400 years, and then there becomes a Pharaoh who does not remember Joseph. He doesn't remember that Joseph actually saved not just Israel, the descendants of Jacob, he saved all the Egyptians too, but he forgot that. And so there was a Pharaoh that did not remember him, and he oppressed them, became slaves. And then, so in 1446, they were released from the 10 plagues. They were released from Egypt, and we have the Exodus. And then 40 years, because they were supposed to go right into the Promised Land, but as I mentioned, at Kadesh Barnea, they said they didn't want to, so they wandered for 40 years till that entire generation of 2 million people die off. And so we have the conquest of Canaan. And so in 1407, Moses dies because he struck the rock when God said, speak to it. He dies. Joshua leads the people of Israel across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. The conquest takes about 6 or 7 years. So they enter in 1407. So about 1400 BC is when the children of Israel have control of the promised land in 1407. That starts the period of the Judges. The period of the Judges lasts about 350 years, from 1400 to 1050. Period of Judges, and period of Judges was a sad time. What's the key theme of the book of Judges? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. There's some horrible stories. I mean, people were being cut up and mailed to people. I mean, it's just icky. Why? Because they were doing what was right in their own eyes. And then at the end of the period of Judges, in 1050, the people asked for a king. They say, we want a king like the other people around us have kings, so that that king can lead us into battle. And they were rejecting God. But God gives them the king through Samuel, who's the first king. There's a series of 3 kings in what's called the United Kingdom, or the United Monarchy. We have Saul, David, and Solomon, the first 3 kings. Each of them reigned for 40 years. And so the United Monarchy was for 120 years. And so we go all the way to the end of Solomon's reign, which is in 930 BC. And as I mentioned, that's a really key date, 930. Why? Because this is where we have the kingdom divides. The kingdom divides. Solomon's son Rehoboam, the people come to Rehoboam and they say, please, can you soften it? I mean, your dad was just kind of harsh on us. He taxed us. But he goes with the advice of the younger men, and he says, no, I'm going to even be worse. And so they said, fine, we don't have anything to do with you. So that's where the kingdom splits in the northern kingdom, which is the 10 northern tribes, also called Israel. And we have the 2 southern tribes, and it's called Judah. And so that's where we're at when we've been in the minor prophets so far. Hosea, Micah, we're right there. We're right there. There's a little Micah right there. Micah. And it's in 722 BC that the northern kingdom is going to fall to the Assyrian Empire. And it's going to happen during Micah's lifetime. Amazing. And he witnessed it. His probably relatives and loved ones and his town, Moresheth-Gath, was conquered as a part of this whole thing. Happened in 722. Sennacherib continues to come in 701, and he conquers Moresheth-Gath. We'll just kind of continue on, see where it's going to end up. Micah is prophesying about this. Micah is prophesying about the Babylonian exile, which will happen in 606, 597, and 586, kind of a series of 3 conquerings until 586, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian king, he says, I am done with you. He conquered them initially. Just be good, and you can kind of stay in your land, stay in your city, and you'll be okay. They don't. They rebel. God told them they need to submit to Nebuchadnezzar because that was from the Lord. And so in 586, he destroys the temple, destroys everything, takes most of the people captive to Babylon, and then you have what was prophesied as the 70 years of exile. So the 70 years, that's where you read like the book of Daniel, things like that are going to be during that time frame. Daniel was probably taken in the first exile in 606, but he continues all during this time. In 537, there's the first return under Zerubbabel. The temple's rebuilt in 516 BC. Nothing like Solomon's temple, but it's a temple. Ezra returns in 458 BC. And then Nehemiah returns in 444 BC. And then the Old Testament closes at the end of Nehemiah in 424 BC. So that's just a big picture. I try to review that often just to kind of help you have those big hooks that you can hang different books on when they're happening. And so where are we? We're right here. In this whole chart, this is where we are. We're Micah. He's pretty much kind of in this time frame, kind of right in here is where Micah's ministry is. And during that is the Assyrian exile that conquers the northern kingdom. Okay? That's the background. Any questions on that? I know I repeat that a lot because it just kind of, repeating it helps us to remember it and to see what God's doing. Historical setting, there's lots of spiritual lethargy and hypocrisy. The reign of Ahaz, the southern king, it brought lots of apostasy, lots of hypocrisy. There was lots of, once again, the priests, they're sacrificing lots of animals, but there's no heart for God. There's true disobedience to God. There's no loyal love. There's no justice. There's lots of injustice. People were not walking humbly with God. Assyrians were dominating, no question about it. The Assyrians were weaker before this, but they became a very dominant power. Ahaz, southern king, he enters into an alliance, a treaty with Assyria. Bad thing, right? Why would you enter rather than trust God? He says, no, I'm not going to trust God. I'm going to take some stuff, gold stuff that they had in the temple, whatever it is, basically buys a treaty. It ends up, it's not going to work because Hezekiah tried to break away from the Assyrian bondage, and Sennacherib conquers Judah except for Jerusalem. He conquers basically all the towns and cities except for Jerusalem. We'll see that next in the book of Isaiah. Remember, Hezekiah lays the letter out before the Lord, but they conquered everything else almost, except for Jerusalem, because Hezekiah trusted the Lord, and then ultimately, an angel of the Lord kills 185,000 of the Syrian troops, and it stops them, so they don't conquer Jerusalem, but they did conquer Moresheth-Gath. They burned Moresheth-Gath. It was said that Jerusalem, and you could see kind of them getting closer. Why? Because you could see the smoke of the burning cities. They're all holed up in Jerusalem. Well, you can see, they're getting closer. They burned a closer town, That's what they burned, basically all the towns, and conquered them, and deported many of the people as slaves. Message, it's a message of judgment to people persistently pursuing evil. It's judgment. They weren't pursuing God. There's 3 cycles or oracles. All of them begin with hear or listen. A lot of parallels to the book of Isaiah. Why? Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries. They were contemporaries. We don't often think about this. They would have known each other. They ministered at the same time. Isaiah, it seems like that he was very well connected to the royal household, to the king. Some even say that he was somehow related. We don't know that for sure. But he's very well related to the royal household and the people of Jerusalem. Micah was not. He was just a commoner, and he was very connected with the common people, because you can see he has a deep concern for the common people who are being abused and taken advantage of by the hierarchy of Israel. Very, very serious. And there's some quotations. That we'll see from the book. Let me go on. Micah in the New Testament, okay? Micah wrote about the Messiah's birthplace, as several of you mentioned. Micah writes about the lineage and origin, the reign, and he refers to him as Israel's king, okay? So Micah is definitely very messianic. But there are some places that we see Micah is used in the New Testament. Obviously, Micah 5:2. Remember when the wise men come to Herod, and they say, where is he supposed to be born? And so Herod's half Jewish. Herod asked the priest, where is he to be born? Well, they tell him. They quote Micah 5:2. He's to be born in Bethlehem Ephratah. That's where in Judea. But then there's another place, and actually, in God's sovereignty, we're going to refer to it today in sermon. I'm preaching through Matthew 10:35, and it's actually a quote from Micah 7:6. Micah 7:6. A son treats his father contemptuously, daughter rises up against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, a man's enemy are the men of his own household. Christ quotes that in Matthew 10:35. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. So Christ himself is very familiar with the book of Micah. Christ had read the book of Micah. Of course, he was a part of the inspiration process through the Holy Spirit, but Christ quotes that in reference to the passage we're looking at today is God must be our greatest love. And it's even more than what would be we would say the highest of humans' love would be the love of family, right? That we love our family, we love, our children, our spouse, and yet it can't be the greatest love, right? God has to be the greatest love. And so Christ reaches back to this Old Testament prophet from this little town in Moresheth-Gath. He reaches back and he quotes this prophet in reference to what he's talking about, is God must be your greatest love. So, value for us too in that. So Christ was very familiar with Micah. So, if you haven't read the book of Micah, you got another assignment this week. You got to read the book of Micah. It's a great book. Micah wrote about the Messiah's lineage, birthplace, and origin and reign. I already mentioned that. Here's an outline. There's a warning, chapter 1 through 2 to the people, warning to the leaders, chapter 3 to 5, and a warning to the whole broad earth in chapters 6 through 7. But here's the key: is there's hope. There's hope. Hope. Oftentimes we'll read the prophets and, man, these are just like depressing. They almost always, other than Jonah, who didn't want them to have hope, there's an aspect of hope. Respond, right? Deuteronomy 28, obey. Trust and obey. God will bring blessing. And so the book has lots of blessing in it if they obey. There's lots of judgment if they will not. Okay? Any questions in the background? We're just going to kind of dive through some of the initial parts of the book. Okay, Micah 1:1, the word of the Lord came to Micah of Moresheth, days of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Okay, this gives the background. We know who wrote it. We know where he's from. He saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, Samaria is going to be the first part of that's the northern kingdom, because ultimately they're going to go away partway through his ministry, but then ultimately through Jerusalem. By that he means the whole southern kingdom. Verse 2, hear, O peoples, all of you, listen. That key word, listen, is a key word because it's used in the book to introduce key sections of the book. And listen in this particular use of this word means listen, obey. It doesn't just mean, oh, I heard that. Like a parent that says, did you hear me? I heard you, Mom. No, you don't mean that, did I physically hear you? Mean, are you going to do something? That's what this has the idea of. Listen, O earth, and all it contains, and let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. From his holy temple, God would judge him on the basis of the Mosaic covenant. And that's really what the temple is emphasizing. Continues down in verse 5. All this is for the rebellion of Jacob and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the rebellion of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? It's the northern kingdom. What is the high place of Judah, southern kingdom? Is it not Jerusalem? Why is it interesting that he calls Jerusalem a high place? Why is that interesting? I get Samaria, right? Bad, shouldn't have done that. Why is it interesting he calls Jerusalem a high place? Absolutely. Their lips praised God in Jerusalem, but their heart was far from him. A high place was a mountain or hill where people worshiped God wrongly or idols. The high place of Judah was Jerusalem. It had ceased to be the place where they worshiped Yahweh. In other words, they weren't really, he said, you're not worshiping me. You're not really worshiping me. Even though you're going through all the rituals, absolutely not. And so it was, he said, stop it. It's a rejection of that. Sennacherib's invasion, this is, if you go back to 2 Chronicles 32, you see where the author of the Chronicles, you don't know exactly who that was, maybe Ezra, he writes about Sennacherib's invasion. Sennacherib is the king of, the ruler of Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, okay? So he's going to come through and he's going to invade Israel. 2 Chronicles 32, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and besieged the fortified cities and thought to break into them for himself. 2 Chronicles 32:9. After the Sennacherib, king of Assyria, sent his servants to Jerusalem while he was besieging Lachish with all his forces with him against Hezekiah, king of Judah, and against all Judah who were at Jerusalem. So Isaiah 10 and Micah 1 give the battle plan that Sennacherib used to attack Jerusalem. This is a true historical fact. You can look at secular history for this. Sennacherib invades Judah. He conquers the northern kingdom in 722, but he continues on and attacks the southern kingdom. And except for Hezekiah's obedience to God and humility, he would have conquered everyone, and everyone would have been exiled in the 8th century BC. 701 would have been, rather than 605, because of Hezekiah's obedience. His humility. So here's the ministry of Micah. Dotted line shows his life. This is the ministry of Micah. You can see it. And then the green is the Judah, or the southern kingdom. And you can see, and we've already referred to it, he ministered during the reigns of probably Uzziah. This right here, why do we have this kind of funny squiggly line, is because, remember, Uzziah gets leprosy in the last part of his life because he goes in and he wants to offer sacrifice. So his son Jotham becomes the king, kind of a co-regent with him. But Micah ministered during this time. Here we see Israel is the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom. Jeroboam II, Pekah, and then Hosea. And in 722, we have the fall of the northern kingdom, Samaria. And so that's the kings. Tiglath-Pileser was the one who actually was a key king. Shalmaneser, Sargon, and then but ultimately Sennacherib was the one that sought to conquer the southern kingdom. Okay? Micah 2:1, woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil in their beds. When morning comes, they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. So the people are lying awake at night, scheming ways to steal. Okay, how can we do this better? The Lord had freed them from slavery, and the people were taking away other people's land. I mean, God had said, "This is your land, and you can't lose your land." Someone could for 7 years, but you couldn't ultimately, or 49 years, you couldn't ultimately lose it. But they were. People were stealing their land. Judgment on the leaders, the princes, the priests, the prophets, all of the leadership of the southern kingdom were injustice, disloyal. They were proud, and so God is rebuking them. And then Micah 4:1, it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and people will stream to it. What's that talking about? That's still future for us. Micah is prophesying about a day when Christ will rule and reign from Israel, from Jerusalem. We understand this is talking about the tribulation and ultimately the millennial kingdom where Christ will rule, which is amazing. This prophet's talking in the 8th century BC, and yet he's prophesying ahead, not just 3,000 years, we don't know how many years it is, but to something that's still future for us. So in a sense, we are kind of in the middle of Micah's prophecy because some of it hasn't even yet been fulfilled because God still has a plan for them. Captivity in Babylon. In Micah 4:10. Look there in Micah 4:10. Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth, for now you will go out of the city. Okay, what's that talking about? Exile. Dwell in the field. Go out to where? Babylon. Here you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the land of your enemies. This is in Micah 4:10. Micah is writing in the 8th century. The Assyrians are the people in power. You think, why wouldn't you write Assyrians? Babylon was not the world power at this time. But he says it's not going to be Assyria. God in His sovereignty. You read the book of Daniel and you see what happens. God in His sovereignty. Not the book of Daniel, but God in His sovereignty, the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians. And so it's the Babylonians who will exile the southern kingdom. But then what does it say? The Lord will redeem you. Here's our Hosea type word. The Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. It also talks about 70 years later, God's going to redeem them out of their Babylonian conquering. They will be regathered. Israel will be rescued and redeemed by the covenant God who cares for her. The exile purged Israel and encouraged godly living. Look at the first century. One of the things that the exile did is it purged them of idolatry. Because you look at the first century, they didn't have the same, by idols I mean the Baals, all that. It stopped that. It stopped that. The Babylonian exile, they returned back. They're worshiping God. They're not worshiping Him correctly, right? Their hearts aren't still right. And yet, they're not, the Baals, they're done with that. They finished that. And then Micah 5:2, that great passage. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which we read during our Christmas season, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be the ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from days of eternity. Bethlehem, the city of David. This is where God said that His son would be born. And it's really significant because this is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. It's a very insignificant small town. It's not Jerusalem. You think, well, why wouldn't he should be born in Jerusalem. That's where the king should be born. No, he's going to be born in not just in Bethlehem, in a very lowly stable. It actually is where he's going to be born. Too little, in other words, it's a very insignificant, too little to be among the clans of Judah. And then here's this key thing. His goings forth have been what? From the days of eternity. Christ did not begin in Bethlehem. His days are He's eternal. But that's where Micah prophesies. I think I have it. Yeah, here it is. Prophesies where it would be. Here's Jerusalem. Here's Bethlehem. The wise men come down, blue line. Nazareth is where Joseph and Mary come down, and they intersect at Bethlehem in God's sovereignty. And then probably the most applicable verses to our lives today is Micah 6:8. And this really, I think this is a great verse that simplifies how do we please God. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Can you turn to the person right next to you and talk about how does this verse summarize so well what it really means to walk with God? Okay? Talk to the person next to you. How does this verse, what are the key things you see from this verse that really helps us to know how we can glorify God, even though this was written, 2,700 years ago? Okay? Go. Okay, what are some things you observe from Micah 6:8, which really is a very kind of a summary, simple verse that's very helpful? What are some things you notice? How this verse can be very applicable to our lives today. Yeah, all right. Okay, that the Lord, it says require. It's not, this isn't, what I already said, this isn't an option to be considered. It's like, this is what he expects of us, right? And did he expect that in the 8th century BC and he doesn't expect that today? No, he's the same God. I mean, he doesn't change in his character. He requires that. Excellent. Yes. What else do you observe? Just some more details of that you observed. Yeah.
As we were talking,
Mm-hmm.
our relationship to God, and also see both tables of the law.
Okay.
Simplified down.
Yeah, there's a vertical and there's a horizontal. We see that in Ten Commandments, right? The first 4 Ten Commandments. Vertical, relationship with God. How do you love God? And then horizontal, the last 6 Ten Commandments. How do you love others? Christ, the greatest commandment. And then the second is like unto it. Same idea. We see that very well summarized here. What else? What do you observe? I mean, you summarize the 3 are very clear. I mean, it's a great summary to what does God expect of me? Well, it says, what does the Lord require of you? Say, what does God expect of me? Here it is. What does God expect of you? Here it is. To do justice. It means to act justly. It means to be fair in your dealings with others. There are those in the 20th and 21st century that act like, well, this call for justice. It's a big thing, big statement. This call for justice as if humans have figured that out. No, God is the God who is the God of justice, and he wants to be just. I was just praying with one of the members of our congregation, talking through a very difficult situation. They're involved in a situation that's very unjust. And we talked about that God is just. God knows what's going on in the situation. Even though that may not get sorted out in this life, it can. God does that. But God is just. But God wants us to act justly. He expects us to reflect his character. The second thing, love mercy. This is that chesed, loyal love, to carry through on your commitments to others. I mean, love mercy. Be merciful. To be committed. Follow through on your covenant commitments. And then I love the last phrase, walk humbly with your God. That's it. Just walk humbly with your God. Don't think too highly of yourself. Walk humbly with your God. Fellowship with him. Don't be arrogant. Just walk humbly with your God. What a great summary statement. I would encourage you, even this week, read through the book of Micah, but particularly meditate on this verse. this verse is, because sometimes we make our Christian life really complicated. This makes it really, really simple. Today, you ask yourself, did I do justice? Did I love kindness? Did I walk humbly with my God? And if you did, it's a good day. It's a good day. And if you didn't, no matter what you got done, it wasn't a good day. This is a great summary. Well, I'm going to tie it up there. Okay, we'll finish off the book of Micah next week, and we'll dive into the book of Isaiah. I'd encourage you, read the book of Micah and start reading the book of Isaiah. Because if I give you the assignment next week to read the book of Isaiah, it's a little bit longer book because it's a what? Major prophet, which means what? It's longer. So go ahead and start reading that book as well. But particularly the book of Micah, meditate on Micah 6:8. Let me close our time in prayer. Father, you're so good to us. God, I pray that we would walk with you and glorify you, that we would truly, by your grace, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with you. We need your grace to do that. In your name, amen.